Hello and welcome back to Parlay. This prompt was written by True Parley Grandmaster Foot. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about the modern frontier of video games. Mr. Foot begins with what is basically a sort of penultimate climax episode of Parlay in their series about the invisible wall. The invisible wall is this concept that Mr. Foot introduced probably over a year ago now in a Parlay from other game designers about the kind of frontier of where games could be made that sort of push the boundary of what's considered possible. They're physically possible to make. You could make these games, but for some reason, there's a fairly clear divide where those games largely are not made. It might be for practical reasons. It's just extremely difficult or annoying to make the game. It might be because it's highly in question whether the game would be, broadly enjoyed or something. It might be because there are ethical concerns, like what happens if people have to make this kind of thing, or is it, reasonable to cover this subject, things like that. There is a space in game design where you clearly could physically make those games, but for one reason or another, they are not conventionally made, or you could argue it, you kind of can't make them, but you obviously, technically physically can. And this is a kind of prelude to the climax of that series. I love this series, Mr. Food begins. I've enjoyed these Parlay a lot too. And we have to get to its central piece sooner rather than later. But before we reach the climax we've been slowly crawling towards, I'd like to discuss three seemingly unrelated topics that are important to the way I see that central piece, which is our next big example, presumably the next Parlay in this series. These are open-ended prompts without clear questions. You could just talk about whatever comes to mind here. This is less of a typical prompt and more of a setup for the next part of the series. Cool, sounds fine. There are 3 of them, so there'll be 3 sections, and I'll talk a bit after each one. Section 1, the magic of synesthesia. Synesthesia is the stimulation of one sense as a result of stimulus applied to another sense. In other words, the ability to hear the sounds in a painting or to feel the warmth of a piece of music. I view synesthesia as something even more general. We like to talk about the fantasy that games can provide. The classic, this game makes you feel like you're X or whatever. Graphics alone are not enough to achieve that. There is sound design and the physics of the game, the controls of your character and the way the game world interacts with your character, the story that provides context for your actions, and so on. You get the idea. The feeling of all of the parts of the game working together to provide some kind of cohesive experience is what synesthesia is all about. You get a bunch of different stimuli and they work together, multiplying each other to create one big sensation. These moments are often referred to as that one moment that gave you goosebumps. Even the contrast of purposefully removing sensations can be used for this purpose. For me, one hallmark of truly great art is that it is capable of creating these synesthetic moments and focusing them on an idea that it wants to communicate. In this train of thought, video games have the potential to create the most impactful art out of any medium purely through them having more channels, more potential multipliers for your experience. Some examples of such moments that I will name through their accompanying original soundtrack tracks from the game, and then there'll be brief context for where they are, include the following. The track Unagi from Gree, the end of chapter Blue. The track Daredevil from Ace Combat 7, Mission 19, Lighthouse. This Is What You Are from Warframe, the finale of the second Dream Quest. A Beautiful Song and Bipolar Nightmare from Nier Automata, the fight against Simone and the fight against Koshi and Roshi, respectively. Bones from Death Stranding, Chapter 1, Bridget. Just Like Sleep from Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, the final boss fight. Pulse and Anxiety 2 from Fear and Hunger 2, Termina, the fight against Kaiser. Just to name a few of my personal favorites. I could go on for another 30 examples, and it goes without saying that these are incredibly subjective. Games are unique in the world of media due to their flexibility and the ridiculous amount of sensory channels they have access to. However, most games fail to take full advantage of this potential because it's far from easy. A couple years back, there was this buzzword of ludonarrative dissonance, which was used to criticize games. Let's ignore all of the negative connotations around the use of that word and focus on its opposite. While ludonarrative dissonance rarely makes a game worse, its opposite, ludonarrative consonance, is a valuable source of synesthesia that can make a game special. All right, if you can't tell, this is a really long parlay as well. So we'll see if we can fit it in time. I'm pretty amazed you had those examples, just to start by saying, I think that's the kind of thing that I would really dread having that as a question for Parlay because it's very difficult to come up with examples like that on the spot or in a reasonable amount of short time. It's the kind of thing that comes to you over time, and if you get in the habit of recording them, you could have a lot of them. But it must have taken no small effort to have those examples, so I really admire and appreciate that you have them because it makes it easier to talk about. Of course, I haven't played very many of those examples, but I imagine part of your point was that you wanted some audience members to realize they had played one of them and maybe kind of knew what you were talking about by feel. Of course, I consider this barbaric, cheating, if you will. We're going to try to explain it manually. Well, you've done a good job. The idea is that games have a lot of different ways that they can act on your sensory input. So, of course, they have sound and visuals. You move a thing when you play them, you operate them in some way. It could be things like the controller's rumble or the feeling of being at a computer screen. Depending on your sound system, I think it's safe to say at the very least that for a lot of people, the sound system they're using for the games that they play is suited to their tastes in some way. The speakers are like the volume they want. They can hear everything fine, hopefully, things like that. The room environment, it's often pretty private. I think this increases the odds that you'll have like a deeply psychologically impactful moment. You're by yourself. There isn't as much distraction if you really focus on the games you're playing anyway, as there might be if you go to a movie with friends or a significant other or whatever. I guess that's debatable, but anyway, there are a lot of ways in which a movie can act on you in a powerful way, but I think you can see how games have maybe more of them, being that you play through them. I think another big thing is that you often revisit them for a few sessions at a time at the very least. It's pretty rare that a game you sit down, begin, and complete within that same sitting. It happens, there are games like that, but not super common, which I think makes it more likely that it will kind of ingrain itself in you a little. It's very difficult to change people's minds in one interaction, but in equal measure to how hard it is to change someone's mind in one interaction, it's easy if you have a lot of interactions. I think games gain a lot of power that they, I'm not sure, often use too wisely by having that type of push and pull. It's not so bad if you just spend a long time with someone. I think that people are more psychologically ready to accept something kind of shifting them in an unusual or unexpected way. If it just takes a while too, it feels like I would just be being dramatic if I was given a piece of news on the spot and felt way different. It could be something awful happened or whatever, but for most people that's just too quick to have the proper psychological impact. If it's longer, or again, there's sort of more times, it feels more dramatically appropriate. It's amazing how similar to theater we behave often as human beings. And I think the games do that very, very well. Personally, I think that's one of the parts that is the strongest, and actually not so much having so many more channels of audiovisual input or whatever. Yes, games have a lot, but I think the powerful thing, to me anyway, that might cause synesthesia feelings more often is that you come back to games, so often a lot of the time. They really have time to get under your skin, I guess you could say it that way. Now, we are using synesthesia in a very general way. I would hate for someone to be derailed in this conversation because they're thinking, oh, well, but synesthesia technically means whatever. Look, it doesn't matter, Mr. Foot defined. I think that's a reasonable way to use the term synesthesia. It doesn't cause a problem for this discussion just because you think technically it's something else. I feel like that's a more scientific definition where maybe you'd have objections, and that just isn't a problem for this discussion. These games can create these feelings, and it's kind of easy to explain why, and I think it's sufficient to call that synesthesia. That being said, I personally also think that it's useful to interrogate the goosebumps thing, because I think there is one more way that games often have a synesthesia-like effect. And this time, it's not so much my opinion about what games are good at. I was emphasizing the idea that you come back to them a lot of times that can be powerful. And it's more, in my mind, this second point about something that is actually debatably not that synesthesia-y. And it's a kind of a sense of epicness is how I often think of it. There are moments in games where you receive so much context built up over such a proper amount of time, a human rhythm of time, days where you come back to the game for an hour or two, that you can appreciate something, the contextual impact of something, in a way you can't with other media. Books can do this kind of well, but it's very difficult with other media. You come back in a very human time interval to play a few missions or whatever, and if the story is building up over time and you play it at like just so of a pace, something might happen in the story that, while it is a single moment, you look out onto a vista and the village that you've been protecting and building up for the past 10 hours of gameplay is in flames and being attacked. And this has real impact to you. Like, you were invested in the story. You had time to become invested in the story. You had the right rhythm and quality of time, and many, many, sensory channels, audiovisual channels. You operated it yourself. You built things in that village. You feel in a way that would be hard pressed to feel in any other medium, the destruction of that place. Just this one contrived example, but you might be able to think of others. You feel bad if a character dies in a way you wouldn't really feel the same amount of bad, except like maybe with a book or in real life, perhaps. And so ultimately, while I like using the term synesthesia to get us in the ballpark of this strength that games have, I do think it's useful to slightly expand the ways that games can have this type of impact, and to, as fully as we can, this is not a complete explanation, psychologically analyze where that feeling is coming from, like what games do that has that impact. I know for me, for example, the biggest example from the ones you gave that I've played was the This Is What You Are from Warframe, the finale of the second Dream quest. And while I don't remember the exact specific moment of that quest that well, because Warframe is super long and I played it a long time ago, the impact that the operator had on me playing Warframe was tremendous and from complicated sources. I was just very surprised that there was like still this mechanic that they were building in. Warframe has gone on to make a million more, stacked upon themselves, arguably kind of messy, redundant additions to the game design after that. But there was a unique impact to knowing that that was going to be a part of the game and kind of concluding the quest that made me fully understand what I had gotten or who I was this entire time. That uniquely came from video games, but I don't think is entirely explained by just synesthesia. I think it was meaningfully magnified by the rhythm at which the game was played. This will become key later at the end of the parlay, because we're going to talk about how you could create these effects, maybe. Section 2, the strand and the stick. I'm very happy you included this section. Hideo Kojima has received lots of ridicule for his claim that Death Stranding is the first strand-type game. Few people know what he actually means by that. In Kojima's theory, games can use either the strand or the stick to make players do things. Just as an aside, I understand, I guess, why people largely didn't understand this. I've never really been confused about this subject. When I heard Hideo Kojima first say this thing, while it is a kind of odd idea for reasons we'll talk about in a minute, I might be misremembering this, but I could swear he explained it like people just didn't listen, I guess. I don't know. It's not that confusing. He said what it means. Anyway, the stick can be used to ward off dangers. Stick-type games are games that focus on giving players tools to prevent a failure state. The strand is used to connect things. Strand-type games are focused on you receiving help and helping others to achieve the win state, often without clear incentives for doing so. In the context of Death Stranding, this refers to the asynchronous multiplayer elements of that game. You can build structures that can be used by other players, and you can use other players' structures to make your life easier. Building these structures costs time and resources in the game for you, and doesn't give any out when you do that for other players. They don't do anything except make it easy for other people, and you don't get a reward or any indication that they've done that. An interesting observation here is that these concepts relate to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. You cannot really force people to help each other, and the game of Death Stranding offers little to no tangible reward for you doing so. I'll be the first to say it, Death Stranding was far from the first Strand-type game. Yeah, that part's a little weird about the Kojima Strand-type game thing. Like, it's not at all the first game that did that. And this isn't supposed to be some exploration of the achievements or failures of Death Stranding. Yeah, no, it doesn't matter. But in the wider world of video games, Strand-type games are underrepresented in the amount of games released. There's something wholesome and beautiful about games focused on helping each other. real life flesh and blood people for the sake of it, and I wish this space was explored more. While strand type game is a silly term that we're going to use more in this parlay, I believe it is the best term we have for them at the moment. Yeah. I mean, it's silly, but we just have to embrace it at this point. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who are confused about the strand type thing are leaning into the fun. Like, it's such an absurd thing, and it is amusing to be confused about the, to be fair, pretty abstract distinction that Kojima is making. But I wouldn't want that. I don't want to ruin that amusement, but we should also, like, it's not actually hard to understand, so we should just engage with the subject too. I think it's a little disingenuous when people really go on about that. Like, you could know what it meant if you wanted to. You can just find out. Yeah, this is an interesting one. So to be clear, I haven't played a lot of Death Stranding, but I've watched a lot of it. And so I do have a lot of thoughts about that system in particular. Is really, really interesting. And having not played it, I'm not sure exactly how a big part of the game that is. But I have a lot of thoughts, and some of these things may be in Death Stranding. I also have another example of an asynchronous asterisk multiplayer system that I want to discuss. What I want to talk about in this section is how you make a game have a sort of intrinsic fulfillment, how you make a strand type game, I guess. Strand type fulfillment. This is getting ridiculous, but I guess it's more like that. I don't really like type game, is just not a thing that exists, but the sort of non-stick fulfillment, strand fulfillment. I've heard it worded as the rod and the rope, and I like that a lot better, but I'm not going to change it now. Just by the way, if you want to talk about it in a way that's less absurd, you can do that if you want. I'm not going to. Strand type fulfillment in a game. What is the recipe for this feeling? Because if you simply make something in a game that it costs in-game resources and time, gives you absolutely no in-game reward of any kind, no in-game feedback of any kind. That is, the game doesn't like tell you when other people use it or whatever. Again, Death Stranding might do this, but to my knowledge it doesn't. And you put it in the world, and your only reassurance that it like does anything, basically, is that other players supposedly can use it. I guess your reassurance would be that when playing Death Stranding, you presumably run into other devices other people have put down. Though you can't be absolutely sure without like looking into the game's code or something that those actually were put there by other players. You know, the game could just be faking that, I suppose. I'm sure it's not, but I'm just saying there isn't like a way you know for sure that that is that way. You see what I'm trying to say? I personally think it is not a feature, but a bug, to have the game give you absolutely no way to verify that other people are using the thing. The primary reason to avoid that, in my mind, is that that is the unique thing about this appeal. You're not doing it for moment-to-moment gratification. But I don't think that making it utterly devoid of notifications and feedback is actually necessary or even good for achieving this effect. And that's good because it is not, it's pretty limited if we can't do anything with that. You can make it part of the game, in my opinion, and I'm going to give you an example of how I think that is. First, let's break down like why you would be avoiding extrinsic fulfillment. You're not giving the player experience or money in game or whatever. Those are the normal reasons you do things in games, the stick-like reasons. So it's something else. The player is getting something else out of it. It's fine to give player rewards for doing things in games, but we're just trying to pursue something else. And so you wouldn't give the player like experience or money, but what about telling the player when someone uses the thing? Well, personally, I feel like this is kind of the same thing. You will get the feeling when you install your zip line to get over a mountain more easily or whatever for other players to use. You'll do that, and then the game will say, like, this has been used by this many players or whatever. And I think in that moment, the game is giving you a selfish fulfillment, a fulfillment that's like, oh, I solved this problem for these people, but like for me to feel good, you know? I would encourage you, if you would like to delve into this topic further, or just with me now, to remove the negative connotation of selfish. We just mean the beneficiary is meant to be you, right? You're the one benefiting from this happening. Very directly. You're not really doing it for other people. It's something you say is for other people, but which you do for yourself. And which people wouldn't do in the same way if it like wasn't for themselves if they didn't get that. So telling the player exactly how the thing they made was used, maybe it kind of turns it into a normal reward, like a stick type reward, rather than a strand type interaction. But just how indirect do you need to be? Because like I was mentioning before, I personally think there's a problem if you turn that dial all the way down to the point where you actually can't be sure it is usable by other players. Not just you don't know when people use it. You actually can't be particularly sure that it can be used by other players. It could be kind of an illusion. I don't know about you, but this does bother me. I want some verification that I am doing it for a reason. This is not about me knowing that I did something good. It's me knowing I did something, that I did something at all. You see what I mean? There are little ways you could do this. In Death Stranding, based on the types of things you can install for other players, the thing that comes to mind would be to do something like leave scuff marks on the item, something very quiet but that you'll notice. And thus, if the game is structured in a way where you come back around to things that you've installed in the world for other players to use, and they remain visible to you, of course, in your world, you would, ideally notice in a very, very quiet way that while you were gone, something had transpired. And I think it would be fairly easy to see that often enough that you could confirm that, like, some things were used more than others. You don't know exactly how much, but if the weathering is pretty dramatic, you might install a few things early on in the game, and then 2 weeks later, one of them has a ton of weathering. It's been used a ton, tons of scuff marks, and another one has only a little. And you would feel like you knew, yes, these things do interact with the world, of the game. You're not being given a direct reward. It's not even really that you're being given a reward for having installed the thing. You just have proof that it interacted with human society, that flesh and blood humans interacted with it. You have proof that the world is real in some way, I guess. And I don't think that this ruins the idea of strand type fulfillment. I actually think it's pretty important for it, because it means that people who value their time and want to do a thing, but are simply not hung up on that thing benefiting them primarily, they just want to interact with the normal world, will do the thing. If it does literally nothing, it doesn't make sense to spend my time doing that. Even if I don't want the benefit for myself, well, I could well enough spend my time doing something else that strand type benefits other people. I want to know that it does the thing it supposedly does. And with a video game, it's abstract enough that I think it is useful to do that in some way. I have an example for you. I think that many gachapon games where you roll randomly for characters, or hopefully acquire them in some less toxic way as well, that's by the by, and thus those are game pieces that you can use to address the difficulty of the game. Most of these games understand that while they want the player to feel like they're missing out and gamble for the character they want, although again the best of them have some other way to get around that, but whatever, they understand that for the game to be tactically coherent and have gameplay that is something, you kind of need to let the player sometimes be able to have a certain type of unit. And it can even make them want them for themselves. So many of these games have some kind of support system where you can borrow from your friends, some units that they've set up. These are more or less fleshed out depending on the game. In fact, it's a whole interesting thing in and of itself, how they work. Because while a lot of games have the idea of this type of feature in common, the exact details are often really weirdly different, surprisingly different. I think that's strange, but anyway, a topic for another time. I have examples I would love to talk about for a whole parlay, but the one I'll use for now is Faker and Order and a little bit Arknights. In Faker and Order, you have a 6-character team, and one of those 6 must always be a support unit. It has to be one. You can pick from your friends, and during story stuff, usually you get one curated from the story. You're working with this character, so they can be your support for that. And you get a little reward for using that one instead and keeping to the lore of the story or whatever. But yeah, in normal missions, you pick one from a friend. You must use 1/6 of your team someone else's character. You can use a duplicate too. That's another advantage, so that they can be used for various team compositions. But you get very little to no reward for this being done. You can set your support roster, And in Fate Grand Order, this is quite a lot of units. You can pick one for each class if you're familiar with the Fate Holy Grail war system. So you got a Saber, an Archer, a Lancer, a Rider, a Caster, an Assassin, a Berserker, and there are a lot more classes in Fate Grand Order that are not in the anime that you might have seen. There are a lot. You can set a lot of support units, way more than in any other gacha game I've ever heard of. Though people can only use one at once. They can really adapt it to the situation they're in, sure. But you don't get to see, like, when that is, really. What happens is that when you log in, you know, the next day or whatever, you're going to see a little pop-up that gives you a summary of which units were used, and you get some friend points, not very valuable on its own currency, that lets you roll a really weak, bad version of the game's gachapon system. I don't know how many, or how few really, you get, and that's because you'll just have to take my word for it, do not care in the slightest, like, that I get friend points for doing this. You know what I mean? I could not possibly care less. To the extent that I don't even know exactly what you get, or in how many you get, or in what way you get them. I don't know or care exactly how many you get. I mean, if it was a lot of them, yeah, that would become a kind of extrinsic reward that would shift how I thought of this system. But suffice it to say, it's few enough that you'll just have to take my word for it. I swear to you, it's not fulfilling in that way. I'm not doing it to get the reward. I pick to put certain units as my support units because I perceive them as being interesting or fun for other people to use. And I have proof that they do use them sometimes, but nothing more. I gain nothing other than, like, the system is working. You know what I mean? I don't even check who was used when that pop-up comes up. Again, you could imagine a kind of person who gets fulfillment out of, oh, did I guess well what other units people would want to use, what support unit people want to use. But you'll just have to take my word for it, do not find that fulfillment. I don't care. I don't even check. I just put up units I think would be fun. I put thought into it. When there's an event, I try to make sure within a reasonable amount of time, if I'm playing the event, that I put up a unit that I'm using if I have it, so other people can use that unit too. Stuff like that, But I think that is effectively a strand type of fulfillment. And a lot of games kind of briefly touch on that. We have limited time, so I'm not going to go into the Arknights example, but that was good enough to make the point. I think that it is useful when pursuing the strand type fulfillment to not insist on there being absolutely zero game-related feedback. Just that it be, I think the big thing is, not immediate. That the player doesn't receive some gratification for doing the thing, like you're committing a transaction, right? Giving the player proof that the thing is interactable actually enables this to be what it is, whatever it is. Though I would want to interrogate more, were we to talk about this for longer, exactly what that fulfillment is. Because I'm having a little voice in my head that's going, but isn't that just the same as extrinsic fulfillment? You are doing it for yourself, but just in like a really, really, really indirect way. Yeah, but isn't that arguably kind of different? And we would need more time to think about that more. But suffice it to say, yeah, I think it is like qualitatively different. If it's only quantitatively different, it's quantitatively different enough than an extrinsic reward you directly get, a reward for doing the thing, that it is different. That it is meaningful to say it's a different thing. Section 3, the illusion of failure, consequence, and meaning. Let's accept that video games are easy in the sense that there are no consequences for failure, or to any given choice. Choices in narrative or gameplay both apply. Like, sure, you can lose a life for experience or whatever, but aside from your real-life time, there's no cost to failing or succeeding in a game. Games don't have what I'd like to call true fail states. You can always try again, start a new save file, or come back later. This is what I like to call the illusion of meaningful consequences. Is this a bad thing? Well, no, I don't think it's a problem. The vast majority of games are designed to be enjoyable, after all, and heavy consequences would place a burden on the player that might dampen this enjoyment. That being said, maybe it's not a problem unless you want to tackle a specific region of the invisible wall, and guess what? That's what we're here for. You might disagree, but I believe that in order for a decision to have value, it must always come with a price. Like, sure, it might matter to you, but there's no way to prove that value either way. If it does have value to you without a price, it's hard to prove that it did. If it didn't have value, well, you've proven my point. It is easy to make a decision if the cost is 0, but if you sacrifice something, that decision gains a certain amount of meaning. Let's pause here briefly. Personally, I may be missing the impact of this point, but I accept this as a premise. For it to like really matter that you're making a decision in a game, I think it's worth considering like what the cost of making the decision is. You get one type of gameplay over another, opportunity cost in a build system or something like that. But pushing it a little further, you're trying to say, well, but let's put some kind of tangible, meaningful, real world price on it. Games seem largely devoid of this. I think that's enough. We can accept that point and move on. That makes sense to me. We're trying to give things a certain amount of, let's say capital M, meaning. Let's say you wanted to create a game in order to prove a point, and you wanted to prove that point by attaching it to a meaningful choice. We now need to attach some kind of price to that choice for it to be meaningful. So what is that price in the context of a video game? What can that price be? So far, I've only ever seen 4-ish methods to paying that price. Real-world money, fun/power, emotional distress, and time. There are lots of complex ethical difficulties in executing the first 3, which is why I won't go into more detail here, and why the vast majority of choices and failure states in games boil down to you lose a certain amount of time. And even though time is a meaningful cost, many players, myself included, probably wouldn't recognize it as such most of the time it comes up. It does not feel like a cost if you play the game to spend time with it in the first place. For the longest time, I've been wondering if such a thing is even possible. Can you attach value to a decision, to a failure state, that is measurable, just in that it exists, not its exact quantity? There is a measurable, recognizable, cost to a decision to the player that makes it a meaningful cost, but that isn't an ethical dilemma. So I'll say that again. What we're trying to do is figure out a way to make a decision meaningful, to have a price, to make there be a cost to making a decision in a game that feels meaningful to a player, but which isn't essentially ethically reprehensible. Or I'm just going to summarize and say bad. Is it possible to create meaning, to attach cost, real cost, to a decision in a video game without doing something actively bad to the player? Like in real life bad to the player. So we won't go into them in great detail. You can see this parlay is, Mr. Fruit, I hope it doesn't offend you if I say, too long to go into these as much as you well could. To finish this in any meaningful amount of time, we have to gloss over this, and I would love not to. You could go back to these topics sometime. I think it's awesome that you're really good at this anyway, but you systematized 4 different costs for, that things could have in games. But we will briefly go over what problems with them are, because I have a proposal for something that may be a better approach to pursue this. Real world money. Yeah, pretty obvious. Charging the player actual dollar bills to, progress in the game or speed up their experience. Or games don't really do this, but you could imagine an even worse version where it's like, oh yeah, this character holds you at gunpoint, and you have to either let them cut your arm off or give them your money. Your real life money. Swipe your credit card to pay them off for $50 real, and then you can pick that dialogue option. But otherwise, they cut your arm off, and you lose that. You can't wield anything in that arm. I don't know, whatever. Games could go even further in that direction. I mean, there are games that are surprisingly, shockingly close to being like that. Suffice it to say, this one is obviously bad for that reason. It puts the player in financial duress if they want to keep experiencing the game. But it's also bad because if you have a huge amount of money, it just doesn't do anything. You know what I mean? It's not really a cost at that point. So double bad. In fact, a lot of them have that problem, that they're really bad when they're bad. They're an actively bad thing to do to someone, but then simultaneously, they're even worse because for some people that isn't bad, and therefore they just don't consistently do anything. They're either terrible or useless. It's bad both ways. Emotional distress is the other one that's like that in my mind. You can make the player feel scared or the weight of a loss or something like that. But these are things that some people may just not care about, But then if a person does, it has real impact, they care about it, those things can have a real effect on your day-to-day life. Like it's not good, in my opinion, to play, let's say you're feeling stressed out or whatever. Do not play like a horror game or like a psychologically involved game. It will get in your head and make you worse off. Like I mean, if you know yourself better than me, but I certainly avoid those games, even though I'm often not, I wouldn't say afraid of them, but just they make my mind wander in an uncomfortable way that I really don't need if I'm desperately trying to focus on other stuff right now. I already do way too much introspection. Having my mind buzz around with some distracting, non sequitur thing that I'm seeing behind every shadow is not, yeah, like that's either actively really bad in the right situation, the wrong situation, whatever, or it may have no impact and then whatever, it's bad. Fun/power. This is the one where I feel like it's actually mostly fine. You could argue that build systems are this. When you create opportunity cost, you make the player pick to have this kind of fun or this kind of fun. You lose the other one that you don't pick, at least for now. And I don't think that's so bad. That is a mildly meaningful choice. Now, a lot of the time, this ends up turning into just time as a cost, because you could just grind the other option. So we're going to leave that one aside for now. Unfortunately, we just don't have time, but I do think it's worth considering that there are forms of meaningful choice where maybe fun/power could be like a functional one that isn't ethically compromised. You pick one thing or the other and it makes it meaningful in a certain way to do so. The time cost becomes impractical, perhaps. You could make games that, I guess you could like mod your save file or something, but that made it hard to go back and change that choice. Or something I often think about is when I could save scum in a game, but I don't, I really focus on these moments. Like, why didn't I do that? A good example of a game where I didn't do it is in Disco Elysium, where your negative choices, or if you fail a check, it often leads to more story. Like any good tabletop role-playing game, failing is usually more interesting than succeeding, although it's powerful to find out ways to make succeeding interesting too if you play a tabletop role-playing game. Anyway, and then time, of course. So what we're looking for is besides fun/power, which is kind of an entangled one. I'm almost on the edge of thinking that maybe doesn't fully exist and is just time, like down the line. So besides that one, the other three are clearly really bad or unreliable. Again, time, it's probably obvious by now, but just like the money and emotional distress ones, you either really do have limited time, in which case the game charging you time probably means you literally can't play anymore, or you don't have limited time, or you don't perceive it as limited time, in which case that's not a cost. And so it's the double worst. It's either actually an actively bad thing to do to the player, or it does nothing. It's useless as a piece of punishment or cost, right? So not good. What we're trying to do is have a meaningful cost that doesn't have a kind of ethical dilemma, is the way you worded it. My proposition is something like permadeath. I think does a pretty good job. If you have unique characters in a game and they permanently die, and it's not feasible to get them to be unique again, or that would have no significance in the game as a whole, the player meaningfully loses something that they worked on, that they care about, that they want, that they wish they didn't lose. But you are not doing something significantly actively bad to them. The game goes on. This is essentially life. In real life, we lose things and just have to move on. And that's not like purely a bad thing. There can be good parts of that. It's fun to go through a part of your life, feel maybe bad about it at the time, but then look back and go, yeah, I don't think I would change it that happened, more or less, but I just don't want to do it again. I would leave it there. I wasn't purely bad. I gained something. I was happy, in a way, to have experienced that, but I don't want to experience it again. I think that permadeath-like mechanics can be like this. The things that come to mind are not getting that close, in my opinion, to tackling this very effectively. I'm thinking of Darkest Dungeon, the first one, or Hunt Showdown, for example. Some people play Pokemon this way. Nuzlocke challenges are, but that's not really the game. It's just something you sort of do when playing. In Darkest Dungeon, you get adventurers to spelunk the Darkest Dungeon, and these are semi-randomized people that have specific combinations of traits and starting abilities. And as you progress them, they gain more and more very specific traits and also lots of hang-ups, like mental hang-ups. They go crazy over time. It's a cosmic horror related game. And so at certain points during your progression, you may let them go, or they will die. They'll have enough negatives on them, they'll develop enough stressors that fire off all at the same time, that although they have powerful combat skills, it doesn't much stem the tide of their sanity falling by the wayside, and they die. And you accept this as a kind of, it's part of the course of things. You know, it's like not clearly purely mechanically good or bad, because to recover them, you would have needed to spend a lot of time rehabbing them through all those hangups. But like, it's bad because they were really high level, and of course, like, you probably lost that dungeon dive, but you can get more as often as you want. I think the problem, the thing kind of preventing it from doing as well as it could, is simply that you have a few too many of these NPCs. You might go through, well, they're your player characters, but you know, characters in the delving of the darkest dungeon. They're not NPCs, really. You know, you might go through 4, 8. 2 whole squads could die if you play a big session of this game. I think if you did a system quite like that, but you had significantly less individual people, and they survived for a few sessions and then went away, or like things would kill them over time, and it was more about playing through the decline of their life as they try to achieve this goal or make a dent in this goal, that may feel like real failure, real consequence, real loss, without like hurting you as a player. You would process it as something that would be like part of the natural course of things and move on. There's nothing good about death, of course. I hope I can live forever, though I sort of doubt it, looks at the general state of humanity at the moment. But just to say that certainly things do pass by. There's not really going to be a realistic or fulfilling state of affairs for conscious beings in this universe lifetime where things will just not change at all. So personally, I feel like you can find a way to make it be that, you know, the very nature of using something in the game is transient. Transience is a thing that I think you can accept as a real consequence. Using the thing means losing the thing. And you can accept that and make that choice, feel the weight of that thing being gone, and have that be an interesting experience. No violence has been done to the player. Not really, anyway. They still lost something, but they lost it in a way that I think people can process as an event in their life rather than like meaningless suffering, emotional distress, or losing money or limited time or whatever. That's my best shot. Of course, something else I would talk about if we had more time is the idea that, I mean, people have designed games that you can only play once ever, and then when you lose, you know, it blocks their IP address or something. You can technically play that again. There's not really a way easily that I can think of to make it so you can't play ever again, but you could think of ways to do this. You know, you could make games that were like that. Making a game that is fulfilling that way sounds very difficult. But maybe a physical game, you as a human could just refuse the same player to play again. I guess, you know, and take away people's communication techniques so the same person can't have a proxy go play their one only time, but they're actually basically just playing for that previous player. We don't have time, but I thought that was worth briefly noting. Games have certainly tried to do that in the past, and before VPNs were popular especially, there were games that it was for a normal person with no computer power user experience, you could not meaningfully play more than once, like on the internet. Final thoughts. The Holy Grail behind the wall. These 3 ideas had been floating around my head for a while in 2017, geez, when I arrived at a thought. If one managed to find a solution to the illusion of consequence problem in a game through what is now known as strand-type cooperation, in a synesthetic moment, that moment would become something special, something akin to the Holy Grail of powerful video game moments. Back then, I dismissed the thought as a hypothetical. Synesthesia was and still is difficult to achieve. Almost no one was attempting to create strand-type games, and no one had a good solution to the illusion of meaning thing. I was proven wrong by our next example, and the reason why this series exists in the first place. And of course, that will probably be the next parlay. We'll be in touch a little bit about that, by the way. Yeah, this is a really cool idea. You can really see that Mr. Food is a person who would like builds. This is just like that. You're like combining different flavor multipliers to see what, what do games uniquely do well? What are some of the most extreme examples of that? And what event could do all of those unique strengths at the same time to fully maximize that, that type of appeal that is so, I guess, unique or quintessentially strong about games. It's kind of like stacking up flavors. You got your fat, your salt, your sweet, your acid, umami, and its fellow boosters, some glutamates, perhaps. Texture and heterogeneous texture, different textures in different bites. Pretzel granola clusters have a shocking amount of these things all at once. Add some spice, the vaunted mala seasoning combination, with the numbing Szechuan peppercorn feeling and the spiciness. Spiciness is like its own metric, and then make the person feel numb. There are even more niche ingredients like that. You could keep stacking things up, but I wouldn't. Sure, it becomes overwhelming at a certain point, but man, is it satisfying when you get to eat foods like that. Oh, it's so satisfying. I think a lot of types of snack food or junk food are like this. They fire so many things at once. Like, I kind of like salt and vinegar chips now and again, and they do a lot. You get the fat, the salty, a tiny bit of sweet with some seasonings. Barbecue seasoned chips can do that well. You get the acid. There's a certain kind of texture in your mouth. Ooh, very satisfying. And this is just like that. I'm sure you'll agree. What a wonderful vision for making games. I think that's awesome. It's kind of satisfying slash I'm sort of jealous of yourself in 2017 that this was likely before Mr. Fruit watched me, and so I can't take any credit for inspiring this, but boy is it in my wheelhouse. What happens with Parley is that people who do a lot of Parley for a while, obviously not everybody who really closely matches my own thinking or like preferences about games ends up wanting to do Parley frequently, but I think among the people that do, a good amount of them are the people you see doing Parley like year after year. And it's incredibly amazing to have created a device with all of you that finds us those people. How would you ever do this otherwise? Like, Mr. Food isn't like close to me geographically. Like, we've talked about this before as well. And so it's like, we would never have crossed paths. Like, who knows how rare it is to find someone who has thoughts similar like this. And yet we have found not just Mr. Food too. It's just awesome. I'm looking forward to the next one, Mr. Food. Folks, if you want your own Parley like these, you can get one using a link in the description. I'd love to have you with us. For now, I'll just say I'm looking forward to the next one. Talk to you soon.